Good morning, I'm John Delano. Welcome to the Sunday Business Page. This morning, the fallout from the imposition of tariffs on foreign cars and GM's announcement that it is closing 4 U.S. manufacturing plants with thousands of layoffs threatened. Duquesne University's Dr. Anthony Davies will share his thoughts with us. Then, why career awareness and workplace learning are critical to solving a shortage of workforce skills. The Catalyst Connection's president and CEO, Petra Mitchell, and CMU's Sandra DeVincent-Wolfe share the results of a recent important study on the issue. And then why Duquesne Light believes that community engagement is vital to its mission. Jessica Rock will shed some light on this utility. It's all next right here on the Sunday Business Page.
This is the Sunday Business Page on KDKA TV.
And a very good morning to you. Thanks for spending part of your Sunday morning with us. Is what's good for General Motors still good for the country? That's what many are wondering after GM's chair and CEO Mary Barra announced that the automaker will close as many as 4 American factories that could mean the loss of thousands of jobs in places like the facility in nearby Lordstown, Ohio. As CBS's Mola Lenghi reports, the controversy involves tariffs, subsidies, and dramatic changes in the kind of vehicle American consumers want to drive.
President Trump says he's upset with General Motors after the auto manufacturer announced it's cutting 14,000 jobs and closing 5 plants. The president tweeted, "We are now looking at cutting all GM subsidies, including for electric cars." GM stock started to drop almost simultaneously as the president tweeted.
I can't say anything final about that, but we're looking into it. Again, that reflects the president's own disappointment regarding these actions.
The restructuring plan shifts GM's focus from sedans to more popular trucks and SUVs.
That's where they're making money. They still have to make their trucks. They still have to make SUVs. That's the only thing people are buying.
But President Trump says tariffs are the reason Americans buy trucks, tweeting, "If we did that with cars coming in, many more cars would be built here, and GM would not be closing their plants in Ohio, Michigan, and Maryland."
We'll see what the president does with auto tariffs, which in theory would help GM, but the way global supply chains work, the auto industry, including U.S. automakers, really don't want to see it.
President Trump is preparing to sign his reworked NAFTA trade deal with Canada and Mexico Friday during his trip to Argentina for the G20 summit. And auto manufacturing was a big part of those negotiations.
The USMCA deal was a great help to the automobile industry and to auto workers.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted, "President Trump and I had a good call today to discuss GM, the auto industry, and how to best support people affected on both sides of the border." Mola Lenghi, CBS News, the White House.
For some important perspective on this issue, we welcome Dr. Anthony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University's Palumbo Donahue School of Business, to the Sunday Business Page. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You know, tariffs, this is an area in which you're a real expert. Are tariffs playing a role in the closing of these GM plants, or is it simply that GM wants to boost its bottom line and to save some $6 billion by the end of 2020?
Well, there's 2 sides to a tariff, and politicians are famous on both sides of the aisle of only showing us one, and that is all the jobs that tariffs will create. So President Trump talks about, for example, steel tariffs and how this is going to help protect American steel jobs. And that's true, but it's only half of the story. The other half of the story is that the tariff makes steel more expensive. And who does that hurt? Well, it hurts car manufacturers who use steel. It hurts refrigerator manufacturers who use steel. And so consequently, what a tariff does is it doesn't protect American jobs. It moves American jobs out of one industry into another. And what we're seeing with GM is jobs moving out of this industry, in part because of the higher price of steel.
Well, the key word there was in part. Do you think that there are other reasons why GM is doing this? For example, economists will tell you Americans are not buying the traditional sedans that we used to buy.
That's right.
And that we're really into SUVs and trucks.
Yeah, that's very true. You know, this is the story of business in general, that over time people's tastes will change and they'll shift from one product to another, and businesses have to keep up. Businesses that do keep up are rewarded with customer dollars. Those that don't are starved of customer dollars, and this is happening to GM.
Well, you know, just 75 miles from us here in Pittsburgh is the Lordstown plant
Right.
of General Motors. I think about 1,600 workers there. 100 of them come across the border from Pennsylvania, and they make the Chevy Cruze, which I gather is not selling.
Right, right.
The president says, well, if it's not selling, GM, bring another car, bring some other vehicle into Lordstown. Doesn't he have a point?
Well, he has a point, but the fact is the people at GM know their business better than President Trump knows their business. So I'm certain that if they haven't found a way to make money to keep these plants open, that there isn't a way, apart from what President Trump is implying, which is government intervention. Now, there's a big problem with that. Because
well, let me just back up a second, because that government intervention, the president is threatening all kinds of revocation of subsidies rather to GM, and also perhaps even the tax credit that we get for electric vehicles that GM says is really the future. Can he really do that?
Yeah, well, President Trump has a track record of saying that he's going to do things that really he's not allowed to do, right? That's part of his thing. So I don't know whether that's a legal question, whether he can or cannot do this, but there's a fundamental economic question, which is if the only way a company can survive is by receiving handouts from the government, is this a kind of company we want in the first place? Right. And I give you Pittsburgh versus Detroit as a good case in point. We didn't bail out steel, and the steel industry suffered in Pittsburgh, and people were hurting for a long period of time. But from those ashes arose higher education, financial services, the health industry, all of which were stronger industries than steel. Now contrast that with Detroit, where we did bail out the cars, and look at what's happening to Detroit's economy. It's horrible compared to Pittsburgh's.
Well, there's no doubt you're right about that. And I guess the question is, though, does GM owe the taxpayers anything as a result of getting bailed out, getting tax incentives, getting reductions in their tax rates under the latest Republican tax bill? I mean, do they owe anything to the rest of us as a result, or as a business operating and reporting to their shareholders, they ought to be free to do whatever they want?
Yeah, do they owe us something is a question that goes beyond the economics. Right. The economists would say what should be going on is that it should be a level playing field. GM should not be receiving any penalties from the government, but they shouldn't be receiving any bonuses either. It should be left up to the customers themselves to decide whether they want GM's product or they want someone else's product.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, of course, GM wanted government help.
Right, yes, yes.
They solicited it, they got it,
right,
and to the tune of billions of dollars, and in the end, they do this to the American workers, and no wonder the president's angry, and a whole lot of other folks on both sides of the political spectrum.
Yes.
So in the end, do you think there's a future for the American auto industry?
I would imagine there is a future, but the future is going to require entrepreneurship and thinking outside the box. These are the sorts of things that the people who work in the auto industry, from the line all the way up to the executives, are best able to address. It's not something that politicians have any idea about. And if you ask the politicians to step in and start doing something, they're in general just going to make it worse.
That's a good way to end this one, because I couldn't agree with you more. Professor Anthony Davies, thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us. It was good to have you here. When the Sunday Business Page continues, a different kind of manufacturing problem. How to fill thousands of manufacturing jobs in southwestern Pennsylvania because there are not enough job applicants. What the Catalyst Connection is doing to help solve this problem. Stick with us.
The Sunday Business Page will be back in just a moment.